This video is an introduction to the mythical characters of Gog and Magog. Their names first appear in sacred texts, firstly in the Hebrew Bible, which is similar to the Old Testament in the book of Ezekiel. Here, Gog is a great enemy who threatens God's people. He's someone evil to be defeated by the Messiah. So here he appears as Gog from Magog, where Gog is an individual and Magog is his land. Sometimes Magog is understood to be a land or people from the far north of Israel as well. So Ezekiel presents Gog as an enemy who leads a large coalition of nations against Israel. Secondly, Gog and Magog also appear in the book of Revelation in the Christian Bible. This is the last book of the New Testament. Here, Gog and Magog are allies of Satan against God. They represent all the nations of the world who are opposed to God, and they are defeated quickly and completely, showing that God defeats all opposition at the end of time. Thirdly, they also appear in the Quran, where they're known as Yajuj and Majuj. Again, they are destructive peoples symbolizing danger, invasion, and disorder. In this version, a barrier is built to contain them, and their release is a sign that final events are approaching. Again, they do not triumph over God in the end, despite causing chaos. So the message here is about God stopping Gog, showing that God's divine power and justice wins in the end. Then we move on to Gog and Magog as legends in medieval Britain. So the ideas of Gog and Magog from scriptures were transformed through legend. Geoffrey of Monmouth was a 12th century writer who wrote his own accounts of ancient British legends in his book, The History of the Kings of Britain. One of these legends was about Brutus of Troy, the mythical founder of Britain. Brutus was the son of Aeneas of Troy, and when he arrived in Britain, the land was ruled by giants. At that time, Britain was called Albion, which is the ancient name for Britain. So the greatest of these giants ruling Albion was Gog and Magog, a tribal chieftain. So Gog and Magog was defeated in a battle by Brutus' soldier Coroneus and thrown from a cliff. So over time, Gog and Magog's name became shortened and divided to Gog and Magog, probably influenced by the biblical names. Gog and Magog as a name would have been taken from the biblical names. It wasn't just a made-up name for the giant in the legend that just happened to sound the same as Gog and Magog. The Monmouth character Gog and Magog is not linked at all to the biblical characters. They've just been reframed to become Gog and Magog. It was actually common in medieval writing to choose biblical sounding names, which gave weight and credibility and authority to legends. As an extra note, Monmouth claimed he was translating an ancient British book with this legend in it, but some modern scholars think that he created or reshaped the Gog and Magog story himself. Note also that giants in stories usually represent forces larger than ordinary people. They can symbolize danger and chaos, or when controlled, they represent strength harnessed for order and protection. Gog and Magog's story has also been interpreted as him representing the untamed forces of nature subdued by civilization. Others see him as a symbol of resistance and resilience, embodying the spirit of Cornwall in southwest England. But actually, Coroneus is seen as the founder of Cornwall. There is a cliff near Totnes in Devon, still called Giant's Leap, referring to when he was thrown off the cliff by Coroneus. And others say the spot where this happened is Plymouth Hoe. Okay, so moving on to Middle Ages London. In the Middle Ages, London grew in power and it looked for symbols to express its antiquity, strength, and independence. So as giants, Gog and Magog represented this physical strength and endurance, and also as figures from Britain's mythical foundation, from the Brutus founding London myth, they linked London to an ancient past older than Rome. And medieval people wanted Britain to have a grand and ancient origin comparable to Rome. So these two figures came to symbolize protection, as guardians to watch over the city. And again, it was common in medieval storytelling that threats from scripture or legend could be adapted into protective figures if the story served civic pride or moral lessons. And the names of Gog and Magog did carry power and recognition at the time. So the medieval idea was that they protected the city of London not by combat, but by rooting the city in order and authority, and a city rooted this way could endure threats. Thereby they stand for the City of London's self-rule and resilience. So by the late Middle Ages, Gog and Magog were firmly associated with civic life in the City of London. Effigies or figures of them were at the 1558 coronation of Elizabeth I. Also before this, there's reference to effigies of Gog and Magog in London from the time of Henry V, whose reign was from 1413 to 22. They continued to appear in plays and pageants, and especially during the Lord Mayor of London's annual parade, where they lead the procession as guardians of the city and the city's authority. So they march first in the parade, symbolically clearing the way for the Lord Mayor. Models of them were put up in the Guildhall, which is the centre of London's government. The first figures put up were destroyed in the Great Fire of London, and in 1709, replacement pine figures of Gog, Magog and Corineus were carved and displayed until 1940, when they were destroyed in an air raid. So the current figures in the Guildhall are from 1953, and their protective role comes from medieval ideas about power, boundaries, and civic identity, rather than from a story where they actively defend the city. In medieval thinking, placing powerful figures at entrances was believed to offer protection. By being in the Guildhall, they represent the City of London's laws, freedom, and self-rule, and protecting these rights and freedoms, rather than just protecting the physical walls of the city. So a version of the legend is that Gog and Magog were taken, not killed and thrown off a cliff, but taken as two separate giants to London to serve at porters at the royal palace after their race was destroyed by Brutus the Trojan, the legendary founder of London. So they are said to have guarded the entrance to the palace, which is on the site of the current Guildhall. So there are also references to Gog and Magog beyond the Guildhall building. There are figures of them on the clock outside the Church of St Dunstan in the west, which is the western boundary of the city. So they're up on the clock, and they're figures that warn outsiders coming into the city and also reassure citizens. There are references to these figures on the clock in literature. First of all, in David Copperfield from 1850 by Charles Dickens. Dickens mentions the clock and its giants, the figures of Gog and Magog, while describing the young David Copperfield walking through London. I used to wonder at the great people going in and out, and at the two giants who kept the clock at St Dunstan's, striking the quarters. There's another reference to these giants on the clock in Tom Brown's School Days from 1857 by Thomas Hughes. Hughes refers to the same clock when describing London scenes familiar to schoolboys. The two wooden giants at St Dunstan's Church who strike the hours and quarters were objects of great admiration. So these giants on the clock were a well-known landmark, especially fascinating to boys in these stories. The giants were moving clock figures, which was unusual and entertaining in the 19th century. And these authors used them as shared cultural reference points who readers at the time would recognise. There's also some hills called the Gog and Magog Hills in Cambridgeshire in England. These are a range of hills just southeast of Cambridge. There was a hill figure of Gog Magog and Wandlebury Ring, which is an Iron Age hill fort, which is now still a country park, which is what gave the hills their name. There are written references to it in the 17th and 18th centuries, but traces of this have now been lost. There's also a nearby reserve called Gog Magog Down. And this book here, I haven't actually read it, but it is available. Gog Magog, The Buried Gods by T.C. Lethbridge is from 1957. This author was an archaeologist and also an advocate for dowsing. There's also figures of Gog and Magog at the Royal Arcade in Melbourne. These are modelled on the figures in the Guildhall, and again, they strike a clock in the arcade. I know this information's really blurry, so I'll just try and read it. These two 7-foot giants have been striking the time on Gaunt's clock since 1892. They were carved from clear pine and modelled on the figures erected in Guildhall, London in 1708 to symbolise the conflict between ancient Brutus and the Trojan something. Mythology tells of the figures Gog and Magog, also known as Coroneus and Gog Magog, having been captured in battle by the Trojans and made to serve as porters at the gateway of an ancient palace on a site later occupied by the Guildhall. It is traditional for Gog to stand to the north and Magog to the south. Okay, so finally, in the ancient Monmouth legend, Gog Magog is one giant who is defeated, not taken to London. But by the late Middle Ages, the story evolves and was tied to London's civic mythology. It becomes two giants captured and brought to London by Brutus and set up or imprisoned to guard the city, especially the site of the Guildhall. And this was part of the push to give a civic tradition to London. So there are different versions of this story. It's not a contradiction, just a later symbolic reuse of the same legendary figures. So their story reminds us that myths change with time and are shaped by the needs and identity of the people who tell them.